"This is the help," Meredith Thornbury said at her own mother's funeral reception, gesturing toward me without looking at me, in front of a semicircle of relatives who had known my face for 15 years. The attorney standing 2 feet to her left, a soft-spoken man named Emmett Sarkeesian, who had handled the Thornbury family's affairs for 3 decades, set down his coffee cup and said, quietly, that he was sorry. But that was not accurate, and that if Meredith had a moment afterward, there was a provision in her mother's will that would need to be read to me directly. Before I tell you what Adelaide Thornbury had written and how 4 small things over the previous 2 years had already told me it was coming, tell me, where are you watching this from tonight, and what time is it where you are? I like knowing how far these stories travel before they're finished. My name is Rosalind Baptiste. Most people call me Roz. I am 61 years old, and for 15 years I worked for the Thornbury family in Winnetka, Illinois, north of Chicago, along the lake. First as the nanny for Meredith's 2 sons, and later as the boys grew, as the person who ran that household, and increasingly as the person who looked after Meredith's mother, Adelaide, who lived in the coach house at the back of the property from the year her husband died until the week she passed. I want to describe the 4 discoveries before I tell you about the funeral itself, because the pieces I collected over those final 2 years matter more than any single afternoon in a reception hall. The first came on a Thursday in March, roughly 2 years before Adelaide died. I had gone out to the coach house with her afternoon medications, the way I did every day at 4, and found her at the small writing desk by the window, with a legal pad and 3 envelopes. She covered the pad when I came in, not guiltily, but the way a person covers something they intend to explain later on their own schedule. She asked me, out of nowhere, how long I had been with the family. I told her 15 years that June. She nodded slowly and said, in the plain, unsentimental way she said most things, that 15 years is longer than most marriages last, and considerably longer than her daughter had managed either of hers. Then she asked me to spell my full name for her, Rosalind Marie Baptiste. She wrote it down on the legal pad in careful block capitals, thanked me, and changed the subject to the cardinals at the feeder outside her window. I did not think much about it at the time. Adelaide was 84 and had begun, that year, doing what people at 84 often do, tidying the edges of things, sorting photographs, labeling boxes in the coach house attic. Asking how to spell a name felt like part of that same tidying. What I did notice, in retrospect, was that she asked me on a Thursday, and that Thursdays were the one afternoon each week when Meredith drove into the city for a standing appointment and the main house was empty. Adelaide had lived on that property for 11 years by then. She knew exactly which afternoons nobody would walk in. The second discovery came 4 months later, in July. Emmett Sarkeesian's office called the main house looking for Adelaide, and I answered, because I answered nearly every call that came to that house. The woman on the phone asked whether Mrs. Thornbury would be available for a scheduled appointment the following Tuesday, and when I said I would check Adelaide's calendar, she added, helpfully, that Mr. Sarkeesian had asked her to confirm that Mrs. Thornbury would be coming alone. I remember standing in the kitchen with the phone against my shoulder and noticing that small word, alone, and understanding without being told that it was a professional instruction rather than a scheduling preference. I wrote the appointment on Adelaide's calendar and drove her to it the following Tuesday, and I waited in the car in a parking structure on Green Bay Road for an hour and 40 minutes while she was inside. She said nothing about it on the drive home except that Emmett had grown a beard and it did not suit him. I want to be honest about what I assumed at the time, because I assumed wrong in a way that matters. I assumed the appointment was about the coach house. Meredith had begun that spring, raising the question of whether it made sense for her mother to be living in a separate building on the property at 84, and whether it might be more sensible to move her into the main house and let the coach house be rented or sold. Adelaide had said no twice in my hearing, both times briefly and without discussion. So, when Emmett's office asked for her to come alone, I assumed she was formalizing something about the coach house, so the question would stop being asked. I did not consider then that she might be formalizing something about me. It genuinely did not occur to me. That is worth saying, because I have wondered since whether some part of me expected recognition, and the honest answer is that I did not, and that the not expecting is probably why the 2 years that followed stayed as uncomplicated as they did. The third discovery came about 8 months after that, and this one I want to describe carefully because it is the one that changed how I understood the rest. Meredith's older son, Grant, then 22 and back home for the summer, between his final year of college and a job in Denver, came into the kitchen one evening while I was closing up and asked me, in the direct way he has always had, whether I knew that his mother had been telling people I was retiring at the end of the year. I told him I had not heard that, since I had made no such plan and had said nothing of the kind to anyone. He said his mother had mentioned it twice, once to his aunt and once to a neighbor, describing it as something already arranged. He also said, more quietly, that he had heard his mother and grandmother arguing about it a week earlier through the coach house door, and that his grandmother had said something he had not understood at the time, that Meredith was not going to solve her problem by pushing Roz out the door, because it had already been handled. Already been handled. I turned that phrase over for months. I did not ask Adelaide about it, because asking would have required admitting that a 22-year-old had overheard something through a door, and because I had learned across 15 years that Adelaide told you things when she decided to, and not one day earlier. The fourth discovery came 10 weeks before she died, and it was the smallest of the 4, and the one that made the most sense afterward. I was helping Adelaide sort a box of papers in the coach house, and among the tax documents and old insurance certificates, I found a single sheet of household stationery on which she had written, in the same careful block capitals, a list of 6 names. Her daughter, Meredith. Her 2 grandsons, Grant and Miles. Her late husband's sister. A charitable foundation in Evanston she had supported for 40 years. And 6th on the list, Rosalind Marie Baptiste. There were no numbers beside the names and no explanation. She saw me looking at it, took the sheet back without any embarrassment at all, folded it once, and said that some lists are just lists until they are not. Then she asked me to bring her the box of photographs from 1974. Now, I want to tell you about the 15 years those 4 discoveries sat on top of, because none of it means anything without them. I was hired when Grant was 4 and Miles was 1 At a moment when Meredith's first marriage was ending badly, and she needed, in her own words at the time, someone competent in the house while she got her feet under her. I got both of those boys to school every morning for the better part of a decade. I sat with Miles through a childhood asthma that put him in the emergency room 4 times before he turned 9. And I am the one who learned to hear the specific change in his breathing that meant it was time to go now rather than wait. I taught Grant to drive in the parking lot of a shuttered grocery store on Skokie Boulevard the summer he turned 16, because Meredith said she did not have the nerves for it. I was at both of their high school graduations. I was not at either of their college graduations, because by then the arrangement had shifted enough that I was not invited, and I want to be honest that this stung more than I let anyone see at the time. Somewhere around year 9, when the boys no longer needed a nanny, my role changed into managing the household and, without anyone ever formally asking, looking after Adelaide. She had moved into the coach house after her husband died, and she was fiercely independent about most things and entirely dependent about a few. I managed her medications, 7 of them by the end. I drove her to her cardiologist in Evanston every 6 weeks. I read to her in the last year, when her eyes had gone bad enough that she could no longer manage a paperback. Mostly mysteries, which she loved, and mostly the same 6 authors, which she never tired of. I sat with her on the 11 separate nights when she could not sleep and wanted company rather than conversation. In the final 4 months, I helped her bathe. That is not nanny work, and it is not household management. It is something else, and both of us knew it, and neither of us ever named it out loud. I want to describe one ordinary evening from that last year, because I think it says more than any summary can. It was February, and Adelaide could not sleep, and rather than call the main house, she called my cell phone at 11:40 at night, which she had never done before, and did exactly 4 times in total. I drove back from Skokie 22 minutes and sat in the chair by her bed with the lamp off. She did not want to talk. She wanted the sound of another person breathing in the room. Around 1 in the morning, she said, without any preamble, that her own mother had died in a hospital in 1961 with nobody in the room, and that she had thought about it every year on the date since. Then she went to sleep. I stayed until 5, drove home, showered, and was back at the main house by 7:30 to get breakfast started. Nobody in that family ever knew I had been there. There was no reason for them to know, and I did not mention it, and I want to be clear that I am not mentioning it now as a complaint. I am mentioning it because it is precisely the category of thing Adelaide was counting when nobody else was. The following morning, Meredith mentioned at breakfast that her mother had seemed tired lately, and wondered aloud whether the coach house stairs were becoming too much for her. I agreed that they might be. That was the whole of the conversation. Meredith's version of those same 15 years grew steadily shorter over time. By year 12, she had begun introducing me at gatherings simply as Roz, without any explanation, which I did not mind. By year 14, she had begun saying the help. I heard it first at a Christmas party, said quickly to a couple I had never met, And I remember thinking that it was probably easier than explaining a 15-year relationship to strangers she would never see again. I told myself that for about a year. I want to be fair and say what I believe was actually happening underneath, because I do not think Meredith is a cruel woman. She is a frightened one. Her second marriage had ended in the year before Adelaide died, and I processed enough of the household paperwork to understand that the settlement had not gone the way she expected. She had been counting on her mother's estate in a way that had begun to show in small pressures. Questions about the coach house's value, a conversation with a realtor she thought I had not overheard, a reduction in the household budget that she framed as simplifying. I think, and I have had 2 years now to consider it, that the more Meredith needed that estate, the smaller she needed my presence in her mother's life to be. If I was the help, then 15 years was a job. If I was anything more than that, then 15 years was a claim. There is a specific conversation that supports this, which I did not understand until much later. About 7 months before Adelaide died, Meredith asked me over the household budget whether I had ever thought about what I would do when Adelaide eventually passed. She framed it kindly. She said she wanted to make sure I had time to plan. I told her I had not thought about it much and would probably keep working somewhere for another 5 or 6 years. She nodded and said that made sense, and then she said, and this is the part I remember exactly, that she wanted to be sure I understood there was nothing formal in place, that her mother's affairs were her mother's affairs and were fully settled, and that she did not want me to be caught off guard by any expectations. Nothing formal in place, fully settled. She said both of those things to me 7 months before a will was read that contained a specific, named provision her mother had executed 14 months earlier. I do not know whether Meredith was lying to me or whether Adelaide had simply never told her either. I have gone back and forth. Grant's overheard argument through the coach house door suggests Meredith knew at least that something existed, but I have never asked, and I do not intend to, because there is no version of the answer that improves my life. Adelaide died on a Sunday morning in October in the coach house, with me sitting beside her. She had been declining for 3 weeks, and hospice had been in for the last 11 days. And at the end, it was quiet in the way people who have not sat through it do not expect. Meredith was at the main house, 40 yards away. I called her, and she came, and she stood in the doorway for a moment before she came in. I want to say plainly that grief looks different on different people, and that I do not judge her for standing in that doorway. I have thought about that moment often, and I still do not judge her for it. The funeral was the following Saturday at a church in Winnetka, and the reception afterward in the parish hall, roughly 70 people. I had organized most of it, because that is what I had done in that family for 15 years, and because nobody suggested any other arrangement. I ordered the flowers Adelaide had specified in a note she left in her nightstand, white stock and eucalyptus, no lilies, which she had disliked her whole life. I arranged the catering. I made the seating for the family tables. I wrote out the order of service for the printer. At the reception, roughly 90 minutes in, I was refilling a coffee urn when Meredith came over with a group of 4 or 5 people. two of them cousins from Adelaide's side who lived in Michigan and had visited perhaps twice a year for 15 years. One of them, a woman named Junia, asked Meredith kindly who I was, since she recognized my face but had never been introduced properly. And Meredith said, without turning her head toward me, "This is the help." Emmett Sarkeesian was standing 2 feet to her left, holding a coffee cup, having arrived 20 minutes earlier. I had known Emmett peripherally for 15 years, the way you know a family's attorney, which is to say I had let him in the front door perhaps 40 times and knew he took his coffee black. He set the cup down on the table beside the urn and said quietly but audibly that he was sorry. But that was not accurate. Meredith turned to look at him. He said, in the same even tone, that Miss Baptiste was named individually in Adelaide's will, that the provision concerning her was specific and had been drafted by Adelaide personally 14 months earlier, following a full independent review, and that if Meredith had a moment after the reception, he would need to read that provision to Miss Baptiste directly, since Adelaide had left written instruction that it be communicated in person rather than by letter. I want to describe the next 4 seconds because I have replayed them many times. Nobody gasped. Nobody said anything dramatic. Junia looked at her cousin. The other cousin looked at the floor. Meredith's face did something complicated and brief, and then she said, in a voice pitched perfectly reasonably, that of course she had simply been giving a short answer at a funeral. Emmett said that he understood and picked his coffee up again, and the conversation moved on within about 15 seconds. And that was the entire confrontation. It was not a scene. It was a correction, delivered by a man in his 70s who had decided, in that moment, that he was not going to let it stand. I did not say a word during any of it. I want to be honest that I could not have. I had a coffee urn lid in one hand, and I was aware, very distantly, that my hands were unsteady. And I remember thinking that the most important thing in the world at that moment was to not spill anything. I finished refilling the urn. I set out the second tray of sandwiches. Then I went and stood in the hallway outside the parish kitchen for about 4 minutes, by myself, and then I went back in and kept working, because there were 70 people in that hall who had come to say goodbye to Adelaide, and the coffee still had to be poured. Emmett found me about 20 minutes later near the kitchen door and apologized. He said he hoped he had not made the afternoon harder. I told him he had not. He said that he had gone back and forth in the moment about whether to say anything at all, since a funeral is not the place, and that what decided it for him was remembering that Adelaide had specifically instructed the provision be read to me in person rather than mailed. He said he had thought, standing there with his coffee, that a woman who took the trouble to write that instruction would not have wanted the phrase "the help" to be the last word spoken about me in a room full of her own relatives. We met in Emmett's office on the following Tuesday. Meredith, both grandsons, and myself. Emmett read the will in full and in order, and I want to be clear about what it actually said, because the shape of it matters. The main estate, the Winnetka property, the investment accounts, the bulk of everything was divided between Meredith and the 2 grandsons in a structure Emmett had clearly built with some care, with Meredith receiving a life interest in the property and the boys receiving the remainder. The Evanston Foundation received a bequest. Adelaide's sister-in-law received specific personal items, and there was a separate, individually named provision leaving me $84,000. Emmett read the accompanying paragraph in Adelaide's own words, which she had asked to be included. It said that this bequest was not payment for services, because services had been paid for, and that it was not a gift, because gifts are given lightly. It said that for 6 years, Rosalind Baptiste had done the work of a daughter for a woman who already had one, and that she had done it without being asked, without complaint, and without ever once mentioning it to anyone in a way designed to be noticed. It said Adelaide wanted the amount to be specific and named, rather than folded into a general residue, so that no one in the family could ever describe it as an oversight or a mistake, and so that no one could ever tell Rosalind she had misunderstood. Meredith asked, and I want to record that she asked it calmly rather than angrily, whether her mother had been of sound mind when this was drafted. Emmett said that he had anticipated the question, that he had arranged an independent capacity evaluation on the day of signing precisely because Adelaide was 84 and had been specific about wanting the document to be unchallengeable, and that the evaluating physician's report was on file and available. He added, without any particular emphasis, that Adelaide had also insisted on being seen alone, and that in his 30 years he had rarely met a client clearer about what she wanted and why. Emmett then said something to the room that I believe was aimed at Meredith without being addressed to her. He said that in his experience, the individually named bequest to a long-serving household employee is the single most contested provision in any will he drafts, and that careful clients know this, and that the ones who are serious about it take 3 steps in advance. They name the person in full, including the middle name, so there is no ambiguity of identity. They state the reason in their own words rather than leaving it to be inferred by people with an interest in inferring differently, and they arrange the capacity evaluation before anyone thinks to ask for one. He said Adelaide had done all 3 unprompted, and had then asked him whether there was a 4th step she was missing. Meredith did not respond to that. She asked one further question, whether the $84,000 came out of the estate before or after the division among the family, and Emmett said before, as a specific bequest. She nodded, and that was the end of her questions. Grant, 24 by then, said the only thing anyone said that afternoon that I still think about. He said, to no one in particular, that his grandmother had once told him the difference between family and staff was who was in the room at 4 a.m, and that he had not understood what she meant at the time. I want to be honest about the 2 years since, because they have not been a clean ending. Meredith and I do not speak often. She sent a short note about a month after that meeting, 4 sentences, saying she had been under considerable strain and had not intended the phrase the way it landed. I wrote back thanking her, and I did not say anything further, because I did not have anything further that was both true and kind. She did not contest the will. Emmett told me later that her own attorney advised her that the capacity evaluation and the specificity of the drafting made a challenge close to hopeless. But I have chosen to believe that she also simply did not want to, and I would rather live with that version. I used part of the money to pay off the remainder of the mortgage on my own small house in Skokie, which I had been carrying for 19 years and expected to carry for another 7. I put the rest into a retirement account I had been contributing to too slowly for too long. I went back to work 8 months later, part-time, for a family in Wilmette with a mother in her 90s. Work that suits me and that I chose deliberately. 3 days a week, 22 hours, no household management, no vendors, no calendar. Just a 91-year-old woman named Perpetua who likes crosswords and dislikes being helped with them. The family who hired me asked at the interview what I wanted the arrangement to look like, which no one had ever asked me in 15 years, and I told them I wanted the hours written down and the role written down, and they wrote both down. It is a smaller job than the one I left. It is also the first job I have held where nobody has to guess what I am. Grant calls me. He is in Denver and he calls every few weeks. And last spring he flew back for a weekend and took me to lunch and asked at some point over the check whether I had known about the bequest before that afternoon in Emmett's office. I told him about the legal pad, the spelling of my name, the list of 6, and the phrase he had overheard through the coach house door. He was quiet for a while. Then he said that his grandmother had spent 2 years quietly building something she never mentioned to a single person in her own family, and had done it specifically so that nobody could argue with it afterward, and that this was the most Adelaide thing he had ever heard. Miles, the younger one, took longer. He was 22 and closest to his mother, and I think the whole thing was harder for him to hold. He came to see me about 14 months afterward, on his own, and told me he had been angry for a while, not at me, at the situation, and that he had eventually worked out that what actually made him angry was realizing his family had let one person carry his grandmother's last 6 years while everyone else visited. He said he was not sure what to do with that. I told him that he was 23 and that noticing it at all put him well ahead of most people, and that the thing to do with it was mostly to remember it the next time someone in his life was doing quiet work. Nobody was counting. I think about Adelaide often, and specifically about the fact that she never once told me. 2 years of paperwork, an appointment she asked me to drive her to, and then sat through alone, a capacity evaluation arranged in advance, a paragraph written in her own words to be read out loud after her death. And in all that time, she said nothing to me except to ask how I spelled my middle name. I have decided that was deliberate. If she had told me, the last 2 years would have been different between us, and she did not want them to be different. She wanted them to be exactly what they were, an old woman and a woman who sat with her, for no reason anybody was recording. There is one more thing, which I found 6 weeks after the funeral while clearing the coach house at Meredith's request. In the drawer of that same writing desk by the window was the legal pad, the one she had covered with her arm on that Thursday in March 2 years earlier. Most of it was ordinary, lists and reminders in her block capitals, but on the 4th page, under the heading of things to be sure of, she had written 4 lines. Full legal name confirmed. Reason in my own words, not his. Doctor same day. And then, in slightly smaller letters, the last line, which was not an instruction to herself, but a note, and which read simply, she will not ask for any of it, which is the entire point. I sat on the floor of that empty coach house and read that line probably a dozen times. Then I put the legal pad in my bag, and I did not mention it to anyone in that family, and I still have it. What Meredith called me at that reception was, in the narrowest sense, a description of how I was paid. What Emmett corrected was not really the word. It was the assumption underneath it, that 15 years inside a family can be summarized in whatever term is most convenient for the person doing the summarizing at that particular moment. Adelaide had understood that assumption perfectly. That is why she made the bequest specific and named and impossible to fold into anything else. So I will ask you the question I still turn over some nights. If someone reduced 15 years of your life to 2 words at a funeral in front of people who knew better, would you have corrected them yourself in that room? Or would you have let it stand the way I did and trusted that the truth had already been written down somewhere by someone who was paying attention? This story is a fictional narrative created for entertainment, education, and reflection, with the assistance of artificial intelligence, and any resemblance to real people, names, or events is entirely coincidental. Nothing in this video constitutes legal advice, and anyone with questions about wills, bequests, or testamentary capacity should consult a licensed attorney in their own state, since these standards vary considerably from one jurisdiction to the next. If this stayed with you, I would love to hear where you're watching from tonight, and I hope you'll come back for the next one.